Marcus had just moved to Riverdale High. A tall, athletic 15-year-old with a shy smile. He was hoping for a fresh start. His old school had been tough, and he had endured more than his fair share of teasing. But here, at Riverdale, he was determined to leave all of that behind. On his first day, everything felt new and exciting. The school was bigger, the hallways were more crowded, and the students seemed friendly enough. But as Marcus walked into his first class, his heart sank. Mrs. Wallace, the history teacher, barely looked up from her desk when he entered. She gave a quick, dismissive nod and gestured for him to take a seat at the back of the room. Marcus noticed that no one else seemed to pay him any attention either. He quietly found his desk, trying not to draw any more attention to himself than necessary. Throughout the lesson, Mrs. Wallace made no effort to engage with Marcus. She didn't call on him to answer any questions, even though he had raised his hand. Every time she glanced in his direction, there was a flicker of judgment in her eyes, a subtle disapproval that Marcus couldn't quite understand. It felt like the whole room was silently judging him, not because of anything he had done, but because of who he was. He was the only black student in the class, and he felt that distinction more acutely than ever before. Marcus was trying his best to adjust to his new school, but the feeling of being an outsider never seemed to leave. It wasn't just the students who ignored him, it was something more subtle, the way teachers treated him differently. As though he needed to prove himself more than anyone else. One afternoon, during a group discussion in Ms. Richardson's English class, Marcus was paired with two other students, Jamie and Sarah. The assignment was simple. Analyze a passage from the book they were reading and present their thoughts to the class. As the group worked, Marcus felt like he was contributing more than he had in any of his other classes. He was connecting the themes in the book to real-world issues, speaking clearly and confidently. But every time he looked at Ms. Richardson, she seemed distracted, her eyes flicking over the class and barely acknowledging his points. Finally, when it was time for the groups to present, it was Jamie and Sarah who spoke up, leaving Marcus to stand silently beside them. Ms. Richardson smiled as she praised the other students' analysis, nodding in approval. When she turned to Marcus, however, her expression shifted. "Marcus," she said, her tone colder than usual. "You seemed a bit distant during the discussion. Did you even read the passage?" Marcus blinked, confused. "Yes, I did. I've read the entire book so far." Ms. Richardson gave a small, dismissive nod, as though she didn't believe him. "Well, next time, try to contribute more to the discussion. It's not just about speaking. It's about showing that you understand the material." The words stung. Marcus had given a thoughtful, detailed response just minutes before, but now it felt like it hadn't mattered at all. He had been judged based on assumptions, not on what he actually said. "Okay," he muttered, trying to swallow his frustration. As the class continued, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of her judgment. It wasn't just the fact that she had brushed him off, it was that no matter how hard he tried, it felt like no one ever truly saw him. Not as Marcus, the student, just Marcus, the new kid who didn't fit in. Marcus was feeling the weight of yesterday's events as he sat through his morning classes. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, something unexpected happened. The class was informed about a weekend study session, an extra lesson to prepare for the upcoming exam. Ms. Richardson made a brief announcement, instructing everyone to attend, but Marcus hadn't received any notification. No email, no message. He asked his friends, but they didn't recall hearing about it either. Feeling left out, Marcus tried to tell himself it was probably just a mistake. He figured he would just show up and ask Ms. Richardson about it later. On the day of the study session, Marcus arrived at school, hoping to get a little extra help. When he walked into the classroom, however, he found only a few students sitting at their desks, going over notes. "Where's Ms. Richardson?" Marcus asked, trying to sound casual. "She already went over the material with us." One student answered. "You didn't get the email?" "No," Marcus said, his heart sinking. As he sat in the back of the room, he realized something wasn't right. The lesson they were going through wasn't anything Marcus had learned yet. The entire class was working on practice tests and questions that he hadn't been taught. He felt like an outsider. When the session ended, Marcus was about to approach Ms. Richardson, but she quickly left the room, ignoring him as she passed by. The following day, the real exam began. Marcus opened the test paper and froze. The questions were completely different from anything he had studied. He turned to his friend sitting next to him, but they didn't seem surprised. They had already practiced these questions in the study session that Marcus had missed. Frustration and anger built up inside Marcus. He realized that Ms. Richardson had deliberately excluded him from the study session. He was part of the class, but she had denied him the opportunity to prepare. As he looked at her at the front of the room, teaching without even acknowledging him, Marcus's anger began to boil over. After the test, Marcus couldn't hold it in anymore. He walked up to Ms. Richardson, his fists clenched. "Did you do this on purpose?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but filled with frustration. "You didn't tell me about the extra lesson. You didn't give me a chance to study. And now you've included questions on the test I wasn't prepared for. What's your problem?" Ms. Richardson turned to look at him, her face showing no signs of surprise. She gave him a slow, deliberate glance, and then smirked coldly. "Marcus, honestly, I don't have time for this," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I have more important things to do than listen to you complain." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, stunned by her complete indifference. The tension in the classroom was thick as Marcus returned to his seat after his brief confrontation with Ms. Richardson. His mind was racing, but he tried his best to focus on the lesson. It didn't take long before Ms. Richardson called him up to the front. "Marcus," she said, her tone cold and professional. "Come up here and solve this problem for the class. Let's see if you've been paying attention." Marcus stood up reluctantly, his mind still clouded by everything that had happened. He walked up to the board, trying to shake off the discomfort that had settled in his chest. As he approached the whiteboard, he picked up the marker and began writing down the equation she had written on the board. The classroom was silent except for the sound of Marcus writing, the dry scratch of the marker on the board. As he was about to solve the last part of the equation, he felt something cold hit the side of his shirt. He flinched slightly and looked down. The ink was spreading across the front of his white shirt, dark blue splotches forming right where his arm had been resting. He looked back at Ms. Richardson, whose hand was still holding a fountain pen. Her eyes met his for a moment, and he could see a faint, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corner of her lips. She quickly snapped her gaze away, looking back at the class, and then said in a sweet, almost apologetic voice, "Oh, Marcus, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. You must have brushed against me. It's just an accident." Marcus stared at her, the ink on his shirt slowly soaking in. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let her see how much she was affecting him. He stood still for a few more seconds, pretending to finish the problem, even though his thoughts were consumed by the way she had deliberately stained his shirt. He turned and wrote the final part of the equation on the board, trying not to let the anger bubble over. "Sorry, everyone," he said, his voice tight. "I'm done." He quickly stepped away from the board, but as he passed by the front of the room, Ms. Richardson called out to him. "Marcus," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "you might want to change that shirt before you go anywhere. You don't want to walk around looking like that, do you?" Her words were sharp, and they felt like a direct jab at his dignity. Marcus felt the sting, but he held his ground, walking back to his seat without looking back at her. Marcus felt exhausted as he walked out of school. After a long day filled with tension and frustration, he just wanted to get home and rest. He didn't pay much attention to his bike as he passed it. He was in a hurry to leave. The bike had been repaired recently, with the brakes replaced just a week ago, so he thought everything would be fine. He hopped on the bike and began pedaling down the familiar road. But as he approached a steep hill, Marcus suddenly noticed something was wrong. The brakes didn't seem to be working like usual. At first, he thought maybe he was just pedaling too fast or not paying enough attention. But when the bike started picking up speed uncontrollably, panic gripped him. He tried pulling harder on the brake lever, but it was like the bike was still speeding away. Come on, Marcus shouted in his mind, desperately trying to slow the bike down. But nothing seemed to work. The hill was getting steeper, and soon he was approaching a sharp curve in the road. There was no time to react. In an instant, the bike veered off course and crashed straight into a drainage ditch by the side of the road. "No," Marcus yelled, but it was too late. He was thrown off the bike and slammed into the ground, the impact leaving him winded. His body felt numb with pain as his arm twisted in a painful way before he fell into unconsciousness. When he came to, the first thing he felt was an unbearable pain in his arm. Looking down, he realized that his arm was broken, the bone sticking out in an unnatural angle. Dazed, Marcus tried to stand, but dizziness overwhelmed him, and he collapsed back to the ground. He could feel blood seeping from his wounds. But what consumed his mind more than anything was the thought that the bike's brakes had failed for no reason. He knew the bike's brake system had been recently fixed. There was no way it should have malfunctioned so quickly. It seemed clear to him now. Someone must have tampered with it. An ambulance arrived shortly after, and Marcus was rushed to the hospital. His arm set in a cast. He lay there, his mind racing. Who could have done this to him? Marcus was still in pain, but he couldn't focus on the bandages or the dull ache in his arm anymore. As soon as the nurse finished wrapping his arm, he stood up, his mind racing. He needed to know what happened to his bike. Was it really just a mechanical failure? Or had someone tampered with it? The hospital room felt suffocating. He needed answers. He couldn't just sit there and wait for it all to make sense on its own. Ignoring the nurse's attempts to stop him, Marcus hobbled out of the room, still feeling the sting of his injury with each step. He quickly made his way outside to where his bike was, parked at the edge of the hospital parking lot. As soon as he reached it, he knew something was wrong. The bike had been flipped over, something that had never happened before. The first thing he noticed were the brake lines, now cut cleanly through. The wires were shredded, and the brake cables had been deliberately damaged. It was all too obvious. Marcus's heart pounded. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to look closer. There was no mistaking it. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. The bike wasn't malfunctioning by accident, it had been sabotaged. His mind flashed back to the series of strange events, the unannounced study session, the accidental ink spill on his shirt, the condescending looks from Mrs. Thompson, and now this. All the pieces clicked into place. Marcus didn't hesitate. He couldn't stay silent anymore. He stormed back into the school, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The pain in his arm now completely irrelevant. He marched straight to the principal's office. Without knocking, he swung the door open. "Principal Davis." Marcus's voice was firm, his words almost a challenge. "I need you to pull the security footage from outside. Now, my bike was tampered with, and someone is trying to hurt me. I'm not leaving until you do." Principal Davis looked up in surprise. His face softened, but his eyes showed concern. "Marcus, I understand you're upset, but..." "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. "I know what happened. Someone messed with my bike. The brakes were cut. It's not just a coincidence. I need to know who did this." The principal hesitated, his gaze flickering to the door as if considering how to handle the situation. But Marcus didn't give him a chance to delay. He slammed his palm on the desk. "This isn't just about me anymore. I need answers." For a moment, there was silence, and Marcus thought the principal might try to dismiss him again. But then, with a deep sigh, Principal Davis stood up. "All right, Marcus," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll get the footage. Just wait here." Marcus clenched his fists, still seething with anger. He could feel the tension building inside him. It wasn't just about the bike anymore. It was everything. The way he had been treated. The looks he'd gotten. The subtle hostility. He knew he wasn't imagining it. This was real, and he wasn't going to let anyone get away with it. As Principal Davis walked out to fetch the footage, Marcus stood there, his mind replaying every moment of the day. This wasn't just about a bike anymore, it was about standing up for himself. No matter what, Marcus sat quietly in the principal's office, his heart pounding. He had been waiting for this moment, finally. The truth was about to come out. His mind raced with the thought of what might happen next. Principal Davis entered the room, holding a USB drive. "I have the footage," he said, his voice calm and measured. He plugged the USB into the computer and began pulling up the video files. The first clip appeared on the screen. It was the footage from the school's camera, showing the parking lot where Marcus's bike was parked. Mrs. Thompson appeared in the video. Walking past the bike, she stopped, glanced around, then crouched down next to the bike. It was clear she was doing something to the bike's brakes. She pulled something from her bag, cut the brake lines, and made sure the damage was discreet. Marcus's fists clenched as he watched the footage. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The evidence was irrefutable. Mrs. Thompson had intentionally damaged his bike. "That's her. She did this on purpose," Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice filled with both shock and fury. "She tried to hurt me." Principal Davis remained quiet as the video continued to play. It showed Mrs. Thompson getting up and walking away, casually looking around as if nothing had happened. Marcus's anger grew. He was no longer willing to let this slide. "I won't let her get away with this," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. Principal Davis nodded, his expression hardening. "I've seen enough. We'll take action." Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. Finally, the truth was out in the open, and he knew that justice would be served. Marcus sat on the edge of his chair, feeling the weight of the situation. The proof about his bike had been revealed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something more had happened that day. He needed everything, all the evidence. "Principal Davis," Marcus said calmly, his mind focused, "there's one more thing. The day she sabotaged my bike. In class, she also deliberately splashed ink on my shirt when I was at the board. Do we have cameras in the classroom? Can we check the footage of that too?" Principal Davis paused for a moment, his brow furrowing as he considered Marcus's request. "You're right, let's take a look at that." He quickly accessed the camera feed for the classroom. The footage appeared, showing Marcus standing at the blackboard, writing out a problem, as he was absorbed in his work. Mrs. Thompson approached from behind, holding a pen. The video showed her casually walking past Marcus. Then, without any apparent reason, she flicked the pen in his direction. The ink splattered onto Marcus's white shirt, leaving a visible stain. She didn't flinch, didn't look back, and kept walking as though nothing had happened. Marcus's jaw clenched as he watched the video. His hands tightened into fists. It was undeniable now, this was intentional. From the bike to the ink splatter, it was all part of the same malicious behavior. Principal Davis turned to Marcus, his expression hardening. "This is completely unacceptable. I'll deal with this immediately. Rest assured, we'll take appropriate action." Marcus felt a sense of relief flood through him. He had fought for the truth, and now it was out in the open. When Marcus watched the video and saw the clear evidence of his teacher sabotaging his bike, he felt a sense of relief. The truth had finally come to light. But there was still one thing lingering in his mind. Why had the principal helped him so quickly? Principal Davis looked at Marcus quietly for a moment, then spoke softly. "When things go too far, I can't just stand by." Marcus didn't say anything, but he understood. The principal wasn't helping him because he had any personal affection for him, but because of who his family was. If Marcus were a different student, maybe the principal wouldn't have acted so quickly. Principal Davis didn't elaborate, but they both knew. Marcus's father was an influential figure, and no one could ignore that. If it had been any other student, the principal might have stayed neutral. But Marcus was different. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said calmly, but in his heart, he knew that the principal's help wasn't just out of morality. It was about connections and the power his father held. The footage of the teacher deliberately sabotaging Marcus's bike was soon made public. It was shared with the entire school, and the impact was immediate. Teachers, students, and even staff members who had never noticed the subtle tension between Marcus and his teacher were now fully aware of the truth. The principal called an emergency meeting, with the teacher, Mrs. Anderson, sitting at the front, looking disoriented and small. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook tightly. "Mrs. Anderson, after reviewing the evidence and considering your actions, I regret to inform you that your behavior is not acceptable at this school," the principal said firmly. Her breath hitched, and her voice faltered as she tried to respond. I didn't mean to. You were just sabotaging a student's property." The principal interrupted, his tone unforgiving. "There is no excuse for that." The room was silent, the weight of the words hanging heavily in the air. Mrs. Anderson's eyes darted nervously around the room, realizing the magnitude of what she had done. As the meeting continued, the decision was clear. Mrs. Anderson would be terminated immediately. Her actions, compounded by the video evidence, left the school with no choice. Walking out of the room, her head hung low, Mrs. Anderson whispered to herself, "I shouldn't have let it get this far." She hadn't expected the cameras to catch her every move. Being a new teacher, she had never paid attention to the security systems around the school. But now it was too late. She had underestimated both the technology and the consequences of her actions. As the news of Mrs. Anderson's termination spread through the school, whispers and rumors began to circulate. No one truly understood why she had targeted Marcus, or why her actions seemed to go beyond simple frustration. But some of the more perceptive teachers began to put together pieces of the puzzle. The truth, though, wasn't something that was immediately obvious to everyone. In a private conversation with the principal, one of the teachers who had worked with Mrs. Anderson closely for the past few months revealed something that few knew. "Do you know why she behaves like this? It's because of her past," said Mrs. Collins, a longtime teacher at the school. "She grew up in a very different environment than most of us. She was raised in a small, predominantly white town, and for most of her life, she was taught that people of color were different. She was taught to fear them, to see them as inferior." The principal was taken aback. "But why target Marcus? He's a well-behaved student, and he's always been respectful." Mrs. Collins sighed. "It's not about Marcus. It's about the subconscious prejudice she's carried with her for years. I've seen it in the way she talks to students of color. The way she avoids them. She might not even fully realize it, but she's been conditioned to view them through a lens of bias." As the pieces of Mrs. Anderson's story began to fall into place, it became clear that her behavior wasn't just about Marcus or a personal vendetta. It was about something deeper, a deep-seated prejudice that she had struggled with for years but never fully confronted. Mrs. Anderson had come from a place where racism was not only common but ingrained. Her parents, teachers, and even her friends had subtly, or sometimes openly, reinforced these views. She had internalized these lessons, making it difficult for her to accept or understand people who didn't look like her. Her actions toward Marcus weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of behavior she had never questioned until now. The sabotaging of his bike, the cruel treatment in class, even the deliberate actions in the classroom, everything pointed to the same underlying issue. A bias that had festered in her for far too long. And now, with her career on the line, Mrs. Anderson was forced to face the consequences of her own hatred, something she had never truly confronted until it all came crashing down. The story of Mrs. Anderson highlights the severe consequences of carrying deep-seated prejudices and racism. When a person cannot look beyond their negative perceptions of others, they can act irrationally and cruelly, affecting innocent people like Marcus. The lesson here is that we must self-reflect and eliminate these biases to create a more just and inclusive society. The story also emphasizes that if we remain silent in the face of wrongdoing, things will only worsen. Marcus didn't stay silent when he was wronged. He took action to gather evidence and demand justice. Despite the challenges and risks, this teaches us that standing up for the truth and protecting our rights is crucial. The use of surveillance cameras and extracting the video helped bring the truth to light, demonstrating the power of technology in supporting justice. When used correctly, technology can help us protect our rights and expose wrongdoings that might otherwise remain hidden. The principal, despite his position in relationships, chose to side with fairness and assist Marcus when he understood the situation. This shows that institutions and leaders play a crucial role in maintaining fairness and ensuring that everyone is treated equally, regardless of their background or influence. Mrs. Anderson's actions not only ended her career but also left lasting damage to her reputation and credibility. This illustrates that every action, big or small, can have long-term consequences, and sometimes a single wrong decision can cost us valuable opportunities in life. Thank you all for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support me. Goodbye and see you in the next videos.